Today we welcome Terrance Griep, who will be here to present his talk about kayfabe in the modern era. Terrance has been working as a professional wrestler, the SpiderBaby, for several years now, and he's had many different acclaims across the United States, but particularly in his home state or his current state of Minnesota. So please welcome Terrance for our inaugural professional keynote.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it so much. That introduction makes me feel like we just started with the finish. That was like opening a match with a pile driver and then trying to fit the rest of the match in. I'll try to live up to some of that. I especially want to thank Dr. Heppen, Dr. Beard, and you, Dr. Reinhardt, for allowing me this privilege. This is everything I've seen about Pro Wrestling Studies Association makes me think it's going to be around for a long time. I certainly hope so. And I'm deeply honored to be part of this inaugural WrestlePosium. As I understand it, the format I'm going to be doing here will be 20 minutes of prepared comments by me exploring the topic. And then the rest, I'll be very happy to answer whatever questions you guys might have about wrestling or life or gaying or superheroing, various fields in which I have dabbled. The topic du jour, of course, is kayfabe. Now, if you'd asked me that question 40 years ago, the answer would have been, I've never heard of such a thing, go away or I'll beat you up. But of course, things have evolved since then. In those days, kayfabe was really simple. It was a line. On one side of the line is what was called work. That was the illusion that was being created for the fans. And, are you guys seeing me okay? I just got a little glitch there. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Okay, thank you for the thumbs up. I appreciate that. Sorry to be so postmodern there. Kayfabe, of course, the actual word, even that's open to debate of where it came from. But most people agree it's probably some derivation of carny, for be fake. And that was the code of dishonor, as I like to call it, that the old territory system that those wrestlers subscribed to. It was a strange thing, and I've always been a little fascinated by wrestlers from that era, whom I admire, kind of tisking modern approaches to kayfabe, because I think, okay, but you guys were committing fraud. You guys were just flat out lying to people. Seems like a weird place to assume a high horse position, as it were, morally speaking. My own first encounter with kayfabe happened only 19 years ago, and it was not inside a wrestling ring. It was a really unique setup. There was this promotion based in Minneapolis called Midwest Pro Wrestling, and they were reinventing themselves. They had dabbled a little bit in training, and now they were committing to this iteration where they would train wrestlers, present the wrestlers on actual cards as part of the training, and furthermore, train them on how to do television. That's where I came into the equation. I was actually brought on as a color commentator, which is basically where wrestlers often end their careers. This is where I was starting, with no illusions that I was going to be a wrestler. My intention was simply to be a heelish presence in the broadcasts, and that was it. Which is an odd way to start in an odd profession. Every story is odd, but not as odd as mine, probably. So in that moment, what we had here was the guy who was running the place was an actual adult. He, interestingly, had started wrestling at the age of 42, just a kid, and he'd fallen in love with it and gotten to this level because he had some real life experience. He decided, wouldn't this be smart to present an open house? So he actually had this sort of office party setting where the wrestlers would meet the fans. There would be no actual wrestling. Free posters were provided. Refreshments of all sorts were there. It was really surreal. And we were encouraged as talent to show up in our gimmicks, in our gear. In my case, that meant looking something like this, but slightly more butch. I hope you enjoyed my analog technology presentation there. And I was the new guy, but also one of the older guys. No one quite knew what to make of me. So there I am with the feather boas and all that, sort of off in a corner, knowing enough about wrestling that mouth closed, ears open when you're starting out, even if ideally that's the locker room. But I I decided it needed to be perpetrated here too, in this reception area. So I sat there, and one lovely boy who seemed very, very taken with the wrestlers had his poster and was going from person to person to person to person to person to person. All of these exotic characters, sort of faintly, the good guys over here and the bad guys over here, but even that wasn't too stringent, which is a point that I noticed. And the kid came over to me and asked me to sign this poster. And I looked at that kid and I saw myself, basically, completist little nerd who absolutely needed have everything in my life. So I struggled with the notion of, am I a good guy? Am I a bad guy? Do I have to be mean to this kid? I don't know what to do. Nobody coached me on this. So I thought, well, we are not in a wrestling ring, so I'll be civil. So I graciously, if I do say so myself, took the kid's poster, borrowed the kid's pen, put the pen to the paper, and then was immersed in this rather cold wave of Stephen King level horror. I realized I had forgotten my name. I had no idea who I was supposed to be. So, having read a lot of superhero comic books, I, of course, indulged in a flashback and remembered the moment when I came up with my wrestling name. Or, more precisely, the moments that I came up with my wrestling name. The first and most important chapter in that sad story happened in a sporting goods place where I had been wandering around thinking of nothing to do with wrestling. I wasn't even a wrestling fan at that point, or at least I wasn't watching regularly. And happened through what we today call outerwear. Back then it was just ski pants. You had this line called SPYDER, Spider. And it was so well designed and all this cool looking stuff with spider webs and black widows and all that. And I was taken by it, struck by how cool all the various colors and images were fitting together. And I stopped, I looked, I assessed, and I said, SpiderBaby, that would be a cool name for a pro wrestler. At which point, I swear, my word of honor as a bad guy pro wrestler, because we never lie, I did a 360 as if to physically look and where did that idea come from. I ended up rushing home. This is pre-smartphone, and looked it up online, found that there was a British punk band called SpiderBaby, a really fun horror comedy by Jack Hill, neither of which I had heard from. a young lady using the name in ways that should not be spoken of in polite company, and nothing else that I could find. None of those were familiar to me. And I realized this name, SpiderBaby, was probably the first time in all the writing I'd done even then that I had actually been touched by true inspiration. So fast forward a few years, I answer an ad on the internet. They need a color commentator. I can talk, therefore I'm qualified. Kind of a jerk, therefore I'm qualified to be a color commentator, a villain, a heel. And now I needed to complete it. I realized just SpiderBaby wasn't enough. So I knew everyone was going to gravitate toward the baby part. So I thought, or excuse me, the spider part was the part that I knew was going to get all the visualizing. I thought the baby part needs to be emphasized too. So I wanted a first name that was sufficiently juvenile. And I thought Billy is too common, Jimmy is too rural, and finally I landed on Tommy, which had the extra benefit of being a word that means twin. Myself thinking SpiderBaby was, in fact, my evil twin. Turns out not to be the case. SpiderBaby is who I am when I'm in a reality where every problem is solved by beating the snot out of someone wearing spandex, as it were. So then there was the problem of the last name. After much struggle, I thought of the word Monday, knowing that I'd be a bad guy. I thought, everyone hates Monday, so why not? And it didn't scan, and finally it came to me, and in that moment, with that kid, with my pen on the paper, Tommy, the SpiderBaby Saturday, I wrote it out and handed it to him with an inordinate amount of pride at something as simple as writing my own name. Little did he know. This turned out to be a very telling moment, it seems to me, because more so than I could appreciate in that moment, because kayfabe is at its core, according to my experience, identity. It's who we're presenting to ourselves in the locker room and to the fans. And if you think of it in those terms, it seems to me it applies pretty commonly in our day-to-day lives as well. You go to work, assuming you have an essential job these days, your boss is a jerk, but you treat him kindly. What are you doing? In pro wrestling terms, you're working, right? What you want to do is bop him in the beezer, but you're not going to do that because you need the money. And then you go home, and what happens? You let it all hang out. All your aggressions, all your loved ones have to pay the price for the work. So at work, you're working, and at home, you're shooting. It's the same principle, but it's more profound than just that. Obviously, the first thing I think most people think of, the people who are familiar with that term, think of the performers themselves, right? And most often the heels, just because they seem so anti-social. The idea of someone walking through his daily life throwing white powder in the eyes of people he disagrees with becomes criminal pretty quickly. That guy's not going to enjoy too much freedom, one would not think. And so that's an obvious thing. Obviously, Hulk Hogan doesn't, when he's walking around in a park, doesn't start flexing and doesn't have the pigeons respond to him or anything like that. So it's not only about the performers, their identity, but these days, it seems to me it's about the identity of wrestling itself. Wrestling, of course, in that territory system, before the cat was officially let out of the bag, and most people look at 1989 when Vince McMahon said in court, this is not a competition, just as a way of avoiding certain charges and taxes and things like that. He was just, and he's a billionaire, so who's to say he was wrong? But that system wasn't going to hold up. The internet would certainly have done away with it if Vince McMahon hadn't. And you could look at other events when kayfabe had to change. But in those days, it was pretending to be a competition. But the thing that struck me, or strikes me now, is it never fooled anyone. That's the part that everyone seems to skip over. Whenever I need to make evaluations about popular culture, I always turn the place where probably most of you turn, and that's Woody Woodpecker. And if you go back to the year 1953, right, when Gorgeous George was just starting out and at the very peak of his novelty and his fame, there's a Woody Woodpecker cartoon where, I can't remember, Prancing Percy, I think, or some figure like that, and another wrestler, and a meeting, and of course Woody gets involved, not the least of which is he holds up two pieces of paper that are labeled script, and the two competitors stick their heads through the ring ropes and read that real quickly, and then go back into the ring and engage in their battle. Kayfabe never worked. It never fooled anyone. Does it help build a convincing illusion? I guess so. But if these guys ever thought that they were actually fooling the public, I don't think so. The closest I think the public ever got to being fooled was fooling itself. It just went along with something that it wanted to believe, collectively speaking. So where does that leave modern kayfabe? Well, the problem is, it seems to me, in defining it, is pro wrestling wanted to look like a competition, and that's where kayfabe comes from. Pro wrestling today, it doesn't know what it wants to look like, and therefore kayfabe, it stopped being a line, and it turned into a cloud where real and illusion are interacting and intersecting and swirling around each other constantly. And I suppose for most fans, or at least many fans, that seems to be the appeal of, oh, he jumped off the top rope. Oh, he tackled that guy. There's no way to fake that. Oh, I see him making some gesture over his forehead while covering it with his other hand. Oh, now he's bleeding. I think that was maybe a trick there. A gig, as the smart marks might put it. That seems to be the appeal now of where the real ends and where the illusion begins, but it changes constantly. It's hard to maintain. It seems to me, so if we identify that as a problem, and I'm not sure that it is, I think the solution is to redefine pro wrestling. And to me, it really seems like much closer to that, rather than a competition, just as you see in a movie, you have a good guy and a bad guy, a bank robber and a cop. One of them will, air quotes, win, and one of them will lose. Doesn't mean a referee will sound the bell afterwards or anything quite so stylized. To me, it's just, we're retelling myths, we're retelling archetypes, we're redefining archetypes for this modern world of ours. And that's something pro wrestling, I don't think gets the proper credit of being a mirror of our current society, right? The villains in the 1950s were almost always, at least in the foreign villain category, which even as a kid who loved wrestling and loved the bad guys, they were always the least interesting, because I knew in their own countries they would be the good guy, and so that always bothered me. But in the 1950s, of course, it was a Japanese wrestler, or even worse, those unreconstituted Nazis who did not learn their lesson in 1945. And of course, in the audience, you have men who probably fought against such people and probably lost friends to such people. I mean, that is some strong medicine you're messing around with. In the 1980s, it became the Russians, the evil Soviets, and of course Iran and Iraq. all those scary people of various sorts. They were kind of going nuts. I'm hearing feedback. I'll just keep going. We've been Zoom bombed. Hello.
No, you're fine. We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry to keep
Yeah.
spazzing on you guys. Okay. I'm getting really weird feedback on this end. Well, so I'll just finish the thought. I mean, the solution is to change our definition of pro wrestling, it seems to me. It's not about pretending to be a competition. It's just about reflecting the hopes and the dreams, as corny as that sounds, people who watch it and the people who watch it and pretend not to watch it. I guess the best way to close is something that was said, a famous quote by one of the greats from the previous generations. His name is Johnny Valentine. He said, "I can't make you believe professional wrestling is real, but I sure as hell can make you believe I am." I think that's our best way of moving forward. And speaking of moving forward, that concludes my part, my prepared comments. Do we have questions?
I'm going to open that up now. So right now we're having virtual applause. So that's
Oh, thank you.
So yes, if you have a specific question, please write it in the chat here and I will convey it over. So as the thanks and everything are coming in, one thing we were talking about in chat is this idea of high culture versus low culture. So you have like...
Continue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
What we were wondering is like the imposition of kayfabe and this idea of, you know, people don't know it's fake. Do you think that was in some way like high culture folks trying to look down on low culture folks?
Yes. I think of Vince McMahon himself as being someone, a deeply disturbed individual who I actually admire a lot and feel great gratitude for. He's like the cool uncle I never got to meet. But like characters like the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, realized so brilliantly. Ted DiBiase, by the way, speaking as someone who's met him, is the finest smelling man I have ever met in my entire life. Has nothing to do with wrestling necessarily, but holy God, that man smells great. But that was, Vince always felt like his neighbors, his snobbish Connecticut neighbors, looked down on him because he was one of those wrestling people. And I think Vince looks down on himself for that very reason. But $1 Million Man was sort of an answer to that. Oh yeah, well, this is what I think of you guys. In a possibly subtle, as subtle as pro wrestling ever is, kind of way, right? It feels more mainstream. I mean, I'm ripe enough to remember the territory system, and that did feel more like, you'd be just as inclined to say, I'm a porn star as you are, I'm a pro wrestler. It was really looked down on. I don't know that the wrestlers ever felt that, but fans oftentimes, it seems to me, did. And it can be so many different things. Like I had a very dear grandfather who would watch wrestling and just laugh the whole time. No matter what these guys did, he enjoyed it. He loved it. I didn't ever quite get why he did it. My mother's longtime boyfriend would sit with me and watch it every once in a while, and he would comment on, like, he would see Jim Brunzell perpetrate a dropkick, and he would say, "Oh, that was real," and then he would see the jobber guy punch Jim Brunzell. "Oh, that was fake." And I thought that was the most confusing idiom for me. Like, they alternate. They're cooperating sometimes and fighting other times? How does that work? But in terms of high culture, low culture, yes, I think as humans, we all love to look down on things. But the internet, I think, has proved as something of a liberator in that people have such specific things and so many weird things out there. I've commented, as someone who loves comic books, horror stories, and pro wrestling, I don't feel any judgment toward any of the other things anybody likes, except for mountain climbers who are all insane. Other than that, I don't look down on anything. So hopefully that's changing. But yes, I certainly have detected it. Plenty of people roll their eyes without ever really giving pro wrestling a chance.
One person asked a question, Rachel did. Do you think that this idea of the death of kayfabe has actually led to more creativity across professional wrestling?
I do. And that's a great point. And it's part of the struggle. I mean, everyone seems to want it to be one thing. I know a lot of the territory guys lament it doing away with the competition model, and you see sillier stuff, you see comedy stuff, you see Orange Cassidy, who refuses to take his hands out of his pockets during a match, right? Which is utterly unrealistic, but it's interesting, and I think that might be one manifestation of kayfabe going away. Now you can do that these days. I think kayfabe now is really on a case-by-case basis. I think every single match has its own kayfabe at this point. And I don't know how you come back from that. I don't know if you need to come back from that. But, it's AEW in particular, I'll assume everyone here is at least passingly familiar with them. You see such serious presentations, like Chris Jericho and Cody Rhodes are doing serious wrestling matches, and then you see on the same show these really silly ones, and I always find myself thinking, as someone who reads too many comic books, what universe do all these concepts peacefully coexist? Well, that one.
We also had a question for someone who was working and training under some older wrestlers, and they lamented the death of kayfabe because then they couldn't tell stories the way they wanted to, and in particular they were rather racist stories and sexist stories and things like that. I mean, is the death of kayfabe also politically correct, politically incorrect? I mean, has that hurt some people or expose more racism or sexism in the older approaches?
I suppose. I mean, that you look at, my goodness. I mean, and again, I think this ties into pro wrestling being a mirror for larger society, right? You look at the Mr. Moto sorts of characters from the 1950s, and any halfway decent civilized person watching shifts uncomfortably from butt cheek to butt cheek, watching this caricature of Japanese Americans, our fellow citizens. But that's not pro wrestling per se. That's just the way society was back then. I think my own bias is really obvious on this, but I think discrimination against women, against minority races, and gay people all run fairly parallel. And my own experience has been, it's been kind of amazing to watch the change in our general society, where in the 1990s, 1995, I believe it was, maybe 6, there was a Defense of Marriage Act passed by the federal government that forbade same-sex couples from getting married. And in order to if you wanted to be a bad guy, one of the easiest ways would be to show up wearing a feather boa and makeup, and you get booed out of the building if you're willing to do that. Generally, those characters, the gorgeous ones, the exotic ones, those types were the toughest guys because they had to fight for their lives in the age of kayfabe just to get back to the locker room. But now you see that's not okay. I mean, Darren Young came out sort of incidentally on WWE a few years ago, and he was accepted by his colleagues, by the federation, by the fans. Everyone has just kind of moved on beyond those caricatures. But I think my own experience with people who regret the territory's demise, the death of proper kayfabe, if you like, they just feel like that's the best way to make money. And every wrestler who's made a living out doing it, that's all they really care about. They don't care about winning. They don't care about losing. They don't care about holding championships. They just care about getting paid. And actually, Ernie Ladd, Big Bad Ernie Ladd, sometimes known as the Cat, gave a speech to WWE, I think when Junkyard Dog was inaugurated into their Hall of Fame, and he said, "There's only one color in wrestling, and it's green." And I think that's always been the case. So it's probably just a manifestation of that particular trainer's unresolved issues toward his mother, I'm guessing.
You mentioned that you've, of course, worked in comic books as well, and you're a fan of comic books. We had a question about the relationships between professional wrestling and comic books, especially that idea of the creation of characters and ongoing storytelling. Have you found that your experiences in both wrestling and comics, they kind of feed into each other and help the other to work?
I thought somebody might ask that. So yes, you could say that. This is actually a SpiderBaby comic book written by me and published by my first ever comic book publisher. How's that for meta? I have found the thing that I'm proudest of in my wrestling career are the details that I bring to my wrestling matches, thanks to the fact that I'm also a writer who creates fictional characters fairly regularly. I can tell you where SpiderBaby, the character, has Thanksgiving. It's different than where Terrance Griep, the real life person, does. I can tell you, and does that ever become relevant in a wrestling match? No, but the audience does appreciate the fact that I have this really well-developed character who, and I even, think when I work in a match, okay, what is my dramatic need? What do I want to win? Obviously, but maybe it's I want to cheat just to honk off the audience and then still win the match, or maybe I'm scared and I don't want to fight this guy at all, or whatever. But I specifically try to give this guy a need where I think most of my colleagues just think in terms of good guy and bad guy, baby face and heel. I'll tell you a quick little anecdote about that. A very dear friend of mine who wrestles on the local scene, his name is Schoolboy. And he was named by the guy who owned the promotion. This is MPW going all the way back, Midwest Pro Wrestling, to my beginning. I was still just a commentator at that point. And Schoolboy was 16 years old at the time, built like a Roman gladiator from here down, but he had that sweetest 10-year-old face right here. It was a great name for him, Schoolboy. And he hadn't gotten to that point, and he was still training. And he was and remains an eerily quiet young man who feels no awkwardness if you just sat in a room with him and you just stared at each other and nobody said anything. That would seem perfectly natural to him, where everybody in this chat would probably go, "Oh, so what do you think about the price of tea in China?" or say anything to end that silence. Well, he was just working security. He was in a corner by himself, and I completely misjudged him as being really shy. So I thought, I'll just go say hi to this kid, try to give him 90 seconds of attention. And I asked him, a lot of small talk about the training and all that stuff. And I said, "But when you're done, would you prefer to be a baby face or a heel?" And he said, he leaned back, pretended to think about it for a couple seconds. He said, "I think I'd like to be a heel." And I reached up, and the only person who was more surprised than he was I reached up and I grabbed him, this almost total stranger, and I shook his little 10-year-old face, and I said, "Not with a face like that, you won't." And we both laughed. That was actually the start of an unlikely friendship. But that, to me, that's the level of thought, good guy, bad guy, that the other wrestlers seem to bring to their characters, with some exceptions. And I'm really good with building a match around something, which I also owe to my writing background, I think. Recently, I had a match where I just torqued the heck out of this guy's left knee, just tortured him and figure four'd him and all that. And we ended up outside of the ring. He beat me up, rolled me under the ring ropes while the referee was counting. And then as he tried to get in, his left knee gave out. He fell right back out of the ring. The referee got to 10, and I won the match, even though I'm lying there flat on my back, right? In writing, you would call that a plot thread. And the audience it was such an interesting reaction, because it just sort of rippled through the audience, where they're like, oh, good one, SpiderBaby. And they're supposed to boo me, but they were like, "We admire the art," if I do say so myself. So yes, the two do feed off of each other, and I can write, where comic books are concerned, the most realistic fight scenes, because to all the other writers in comics, they're fiction. To me, they are autobiographies.
That actually brings up something we were talking about earlier today with a different presentation, about the idea of, do professional wrestlers see themselves as actors? And if they don't, why not?
Yeah, I'll speak for myself. I do think it doesn't feel like acting to me. I've done a little bit of acting, but to me, it just feels much more immediate. I become this other person. He's not a villain. He's not evil. I don't think of him as a heel. In fact, another little writing point, I'll come back to yours, is often he starts off wrestling fairly clean, and then he gets frustrated as he keeps getting out wrestled, and then he has to cheat or lose, and he's not going to lose. And so the audience gets to sort of come along for that journey into, to call it evil is too, mischief, we'll call it, there's a reason for it, rather than, oh, he's just a bad guy from the start. To me, it just feels like I'm traveling to another dimension. It's a reality where everyone wears spandex, and the solution to every problem is you just beat the snot out of the guy in front of you, and then you come out of that reality and you're back in your day-to-day life, and the old rules are implied. While you're doing it, you're not thinking, you are aware of the audience, you are aware of your opponent, you are aware of all this stuff. But the difference, it seems to me, between this and acting is there's no second take. There's what you're doing, it's right there in front of everyone. They're all going to see it. And for better or for worse, often for worse, you just keep going. So no, to me, it doesn't feel like acting. It feels like becoming.
We also have a discussion going on right now in chat regarding definitely Orange Cassidy. It's kind of started there, but then it kind of went into this idea of comedy wrestling. And I know there's always been comedy wrestling, but do you think that that has changed over time in relationship to these changes about how we think about kayfabe?
Yes, it definitely has. The old comedy has always had its place in wrestling, but it was more a matter of staying within that competitive milieu. Ooh, there's a fancy pro wrestler word. To me, it seems like mean, the heel is out there celebrating some dastardly victory. He has a cake, and the baby face smashes his face. The baby face he stole a championship from, say, smashes his face right into the cake, and he looks up and and the bits of cake are falling off, and there's sort of a womp womp moment. That could all happen if it were a legitimate competition, right? It's comedy. Everyone's laughing at the heel. But it's not delving into the absurd. And kayfabe, it seems to me, just it asks in those instances of comedy wrestling, which is not my preference. I would rather do the more traditional wrestling. People who compliment me and criticize me both say that I look like I'm wrestling in the year 1985. And I don't disagree with them at all. And that was when kayfabe still existed, I suppose. But I personally don't like it. I don't take as much offense to it as I see so many of the territory guys just seem like it's an insult to pro wrestling. And I think, yeah, but most people thought of pro wrestling as kind of an insult in and of itself. I mean, the idea of someone getting huffy about it being presented in an undignified way would strike non-wrestling fans as quite ironic and downright ridiculous. So I don't know. That's part of what I was struggling with in my prepared comments is I don't know what the answer is. I wish it wasn't happening, but I don't think it's going to go away until there's another Stone Cold Steve Austin or Hulk Hogan that just becomes so popular by force of their own personality that they might be able to change the whole complexion of wrestling. But it'll always have its novelty. And you look at the other thing too. Sorry that as I'm formulating thoughts here. You look at like the little person matches. In those days, they were called midget matches, and that's the term I'm actually used to. I've wrestled midgets, made two of them tap out. I told them both in the back that swirling sound you heard during our match, that was my father spinning in his grave. But those were always silly matches, right? Those were not done in any sort of serious way. So comedy's always been there. And it's just something, I guess, is part of a card. You have your cruiserweights, you have women's matches, tag team matches. I guess comedy might become a sub-genre of sorts.
And that actually has been causing some discussion too in the chat about this idea of kids. And there's that sense because you were talking about your encounter with the kid who wanted his poster signed. Mm-hmm. And when that kid was engaging with everyone, was he in the kayfabe mindset? Because there is this sense of, do kids think it's all real? And then at some point you grow up and you learn that it's not.
That's a case-by-case thing. I know like Jake the Snake Roberts has blamed, at least partly, his infamous legendary drug use on the fact that his father, Grizzly Smith, did not smarten him up. And so he just thought his dad was getting beat up night after night after night. The kid specifically, I thought was associated with somebody there. So I got the feeling that he had a sense that, okay, the heels aren't going to poke me in the eye or anything like that. I do remember my first championship when it was time for me to lose it. And it was the culmination of this really wild feud. And I was really proud of the matches. This guy and I, and the way we were presenting it is he was coming closer and closer, and I was keep continuing to outmaneuver him with scuzzy little manipulations of the system. And got disqualified. Too bad. That kind of thing. And what I didn't know is he had brought like his son, who may have been 8 years old at that time, around the same age as this kid. And I made a point before the match of finding that kid, because I hadn't known he was there. This was like 3 or 4 matches into our feud. And just sort of talking to him, I wasn't saying, hey, your dad and I are actually cooperating or anything like that. But I just was asking him, how do you like watching your dad? Are you doing okay? And this kind of thing. And I still don't know exactly what his dad did or didn't tell him. And it's frankly none of my business. But by speaking to him directly in a non-maniacal way, as he may have seen me in the ring, I think I put him somewhat at ease, that he understood, okay, this guy is not completely out of control, as I might think when he's beating the snot out of my father. There's more to it. And I got the sense that there was some level of relief and comfort on his part. That was my intention anyway. But I'll mention one other story. Boy, this one, title change, the tag team match, very wild, the culmination of a bitter feud. I get finished I'm the legal heel, the legal baby face finishes me, but the referee is distracted with my partner, who's illegal, and another baby face, the other teammate, who's illegal. The referee's over there. They're all doing their thing. So the good guy, who has me dead to rights, decides, well, he's recovering, I better do something else to him. And as he reaches down and pulls me up, I reach up and I threw a fireball into his face, right? And the place, I'll never forget that sound where I heard this whoom. I thought, that's a thunderbolt. I just threw that. That's what happens when you thunder, when lightning and thunder and the air. I just threw it. I'm Zeus. I am Zeus. I'm the god of thunder. I am Thor. So it was, of course, we were cooperating. He fell backwards and he's writhing around, and I grabbed him by the weight belt he was wearing. I held it up, and 1, 2, 3, and the place goes nuts. And we get out of the ring, we grab the titles, and he's lying there. And there really was this burning smell that was actually just flash paper, but it was pretty dreadful. And a lot of people asked me afterwards about what was that. But one of the wrestlers came to the back and said, SpiderBaby, I don't know how to tell you this, but the entire front row of kids are crying their eyes out after you threw the fireball. And I'm like, oh God, oh well. 12 years of therapy and an ice cream cone, and I'm sure they'll all be fine. So I hope we never saw any of those kids come back either. So that's probably just a coincidence. But I don't think they were, I think they understood it was presentation, but they were the fire. I think it was just the fire itself that may have startled them. It startled everyone. It was so cool.
That actually brings me to another question that was being discussed in talking about what led to this idea of the death of kayfabe. Someone mentioned, ECW and death matches and matches where they really embrace the blood, even to the extent where, it's not a gig, where it's not blading and things like that. Do you think that going red and trying to actually draw out real blood is actually a way to keep kayfabe, to keep it real, the illusion?
Yeah, it's a fake cut way to keep it real. Yeah, I get that's sort of a Zen koan. I wish I hadn't given up marijuana. I just go on a mountaintop and just think that one through. Hey, man. Yeah. Blood has its place, but I think it should be used sparingly. I've never done it deliberately, as you can tell by my pristine and very large forehead. I've told the promoters locally, I said, Vince McMahon, Dixie Carter, they tell me to cut, I'll cut as deep as they want. I'll give them enough blood to drink. But you guys, no, I'm not doing that for you. But I've been bopped in the beezer a time or two, and I actually got concussed once, botched moonsault. Moonsault's supposed to be landing chest to chest after a wrestler, the offending wrestler. I'm lying flat on my back. He goes to the corner, stands on the top rope facing out, and then backflips in chest to chest. His sternum landed right about here and nearly broke my nose and definitely gave me a pretty serious concussion. And I was just bleeding constantly. I mean, like water flow, like a waterfall is what I'm trying to say. And the audience was horrified. They were, and I'm the villain, but they knew that there's this line that I'm a performer, I'm entertaining, and they saw that this was a real injury. I do think, yeah, it's my own thought on it is everyone seems to be smart to that practice of it looks, you know, the guy gets thrown out of the ring ropes. Here's the concrete, and then you see him, his hand just suddenly mysteriously disappear, maybe a little rubbing action, and then I'm bleeding, right? Everyone knows the trick, so I don't know how much it adds to a match. I've almost always, every time I've seen it on the indie scene, I think every time it's the wrestlers have done it themselves. The promoter, the booker, none of the background people asked for it. The wrestlers are just such marks. They decided let's bleed, and well, like superstar Billy Graham famously, when he won the championship from Bruno Sammartino, the WWF championship in 1977, he decided that was an important enough moment that he had to, and he did, and he was right. It was, particularly since he was winning the title, he had to make Bruno, the revered good guy, look as strong as possible. That's how you do it. But does it build kayfabe anymore? I don't think so, because all the smart marks know that trick.
And maybe one last question, kind of going off of what you just said. What do you think about fans who really focus on botches and whiffs?
I hate that trait wherever I see it. I hate websites like WrestleCrap or just basically I just have nothing but contempt for people like that. It has nothing to do with wrestling per se. It's just that's where I encounter it. But as someone who has busted his tail to realize two dream jobs, right? Writing comics and wrestling professionally, I have no time, no patience for people who are just going to sit on the sidelines and throw spitballs at the people who actually have the nerve to go after their dreams, the dreams of the sitters. It seems to me the most cowardly, despicable, disgusting display of cowardice. And I think everyone who does that kind of stuff, you effed up, that kind of stuff, look in the mirror. You need to do something with your life, because calling out wrestlers who do 90 moves right and then screw up the 91st one, and you're there to yell at them, there's something wrong with your life.
It's almost like they're true heels in this whole story.
Yes. Anyone can be a heel in real life. It takes an artist to be a heel in the ring.
I think that's a good note to end on. So Terrance, thank you so much for coming in, or virtually at least, and being our first professional keynote speaker.
What an honor. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for having me. And my bad guy penchant notwithstanding, I hope everyone stays safe in these uncertain times. Be well, everyone.
Thank you so much, and same to you, Spider Baby. Have a good one for the rest of the day.